Today we're going to dive into the unprecedented list of the federal clemencies, from prison murders and bank robberies to kidnapping for ransom schemes. These cases represent some of the most notorious federal crimes in modern history. We're going to quickly break down the details behind each of these names, shedding light to why these individuals ended up on death row. Make no doubt about it, today's Monday, December the 23rd. Biden releases at 3 o'clock in the morning, right before a Christmas holiday. No coincidence to get this buried within the holiday, so you get folks not talking about it as much as if it was a regular time of the year, like let's say January. Slap in the face to the victims. These are the people that we need to remember as I'm reading out these names. So, and also some of these names I'm not going to be able to pronounce, so I'll spell them out if I can. Shannon Wayne AGI, convicted and sentenced to death for the killing of a prisoner in federal prison. Billy Allen, convicted and sentenced for the death for involvement in an armed bank robbery due to which a bank guard was killed. A. Barnett, convicted and sentenced to death for the killing of his ex-girlfriend, as well as another man in a carjacking. Basham, convicted and sentenced to death for kidnapping and death of a woman following an escape from prison. Anthony Battle, convicted and sentenced to death for the killing of a prison guard. Jason Brown, convicted and sentenced to death for the fatal stabbing of a postal worker. Carlos David Caro, convicted and sentenced to death for killing of a prisoner in a federal prison. Wesley Paul Coon, convicted and sentenced to death for the killing of a fellow prisoner in the mental health unit of a federal prison. Brandon Michael Council, convicted and sentenced to the death for killing 2 bank employees during the course of a bank robbery. Christopher Emery Kramer, convicted and sentenced to death for the killing of a fellow prisoner in a federal prison. Len Davis, he was a police officer and sentenced to death for ordering the killing of a witness for an internal affairs investigation into a police misconduct complaint against him. Joseph Ebron, convicted and sentenced to death for the killing of a prisoner in federal prison. Ricky Allen Fackrell, convicted and sentenced to death for the killing of a fellow prisoner in a federal prison. Edward Leon Fields pleaded guilty and sentenced to death for the fatal shootings 2 campers on federal land. Chadric Evan Fulks pleaded guilty and sentenced to the death for the kidnapping and death of a woman following escape from prison. Marvin Charles Gabrion II, convicted and sentenced to death for killing a woman on federal land. Edgar Garcia, convicted and sentenced to death for the fatal stabbing fellow prisoner while incarcerated in a federal prison. Thomas Hagar, convicted and sentenced to death for a drug-related killing. Charles Michael Hall, convicted and sentenced to death for the killing of a fellow prisoner in a mental health unit of a federal prison. Norris Holder, convicted and sentenced to death for the fatal shooting of a security guard during a bank robbery. Richard Allen Jackson, convicted and sentenced to death for the fatal shooting of a woman while on federal property in North Carolina. Jurijus Kadamovas, convicted and sentenced to the death for involvement in the killings and kidnappings for ransom 5 Russian and Georgian immigrants. Daryl Lawrence, convicted and sentenced to death for the fatal shooting of a special duty police officer during an attempted bank robbery. Lori Michael, convicted and sentenced to the death for the involvement in the killings and kidnappings for ransom of 5 Russian and Georgian immigrants. James Rohn, convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. He was involved in the 1991 killings of 2 people in a robbery. Julius Omar Robinson, convicted for his involvement in multiple murders and violent crimes, including the 1994 killing of a woman. David Anthony Runyon, convicted of several violent crimes, including armed robbery and assault. Richard Sanchez Jr., convicted for drug trafficking and involvement in organized crime. Thomas Stephen Sanders, convicted of a series of armed robberies leading to charges of violent crimes and robbery. Savage, convicted of multiple crimes, including drug trafficking, murder, and conspiracy. He was involved in a violent drug organization and orchestrated murders to protect his criminal activities. Mark Isaac Snarr, convicted of participating in violent crime spree, including armed robberies. R. Taylor, convicted for drug-related crimes and other violent offenses. Richard Tipton, convicted for violent crimes, including murder in connection with gang activity. George Torres, convicted of rape and murder of 2 women and additional charges related to assault and murder. Daniel Troya, convicted for his involvement in drug trafficking and gang-related violence. And Alejandro Umman, convicted for drug trafficking, including involvement in large-scale smuggling operations. Thoughts and prayers to the families of these victims during the Christmas holidays.